Hello, my name is Willard Beck, and welcome you to this review or this commemoration of Juneteenth, and here in the United States of America. I call it Juneteenth, Birth of a Nation. We want to talk today about what is Juneteenth? Why was it important then? Why is it important now? And we'll cover some of the American history that provides a context for Juneteenth. We'll also look at what was happening in America at the time of the circumstances and conditions that created Juneteenth. And finally, we're going to look at Juneteenth today and what is its significance. So, what is Juneteenth and what happened? Look at American history, you'll see that there was, in 1607, first British colonialists arrived in America. 1676, there was a incident in history called Bacon's Rebellion. And 1776, there was the first North American Civil War between the British colonists and the British government. In 1850, something passed called the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln. 1861, the second Civil War in North America started. And in 1863, there was the production of the Emancipation Proclamation, followed shortly in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. So let's go back to the beginning. In 1607, English colonists arrived in North America into the Virginia area, settled Jamestown, and these are economic migrants. They came to America looking for, to find their fortune, to benefit economically. It was the beginning of it was pre-capitalism. So it was through this that the concept of a business corporation emerged, with the monarchy in England granting charters to folk, giving them permission to go and act on behalf of the monarchy in these new places. And so many folk came and to seek their fortune. And sometimes because when people came over here, in order to create the conditions that they needed to have the success that they sought, they needed human resources. They needed people to work. And oftentimes, the poor in English society at that time in the 1600s, 1607, was very similar economically to American society, where there was a great economic disparity. People on the top, the monarchy, the royalty, and people on the bottom, peasants. And, while the royalty and the gentry, the folk who had resources, could put together what they needed in order to get a boat and sail over to America, they really also needed people to work the land. So folk would volunteer for this, enter into this agreement called indentured servitude, where they would say, hey, take me on the boat over to America, and I'll work for you 5 years. And after that, you'll give me you'll let me go, and I'll be able to leave, and you'll give me 2 acres of land, something like that, to compensate me for my labor. So in 1619, in order to continue with this need to provide labor, the English started importing Africans from the African continent. It was part of the African chattel enslavement system. And at that time, in the beginning, many of the Africans that came over here, they were considered indentured servants, just like the Europeans who came. So they'd come, they'd work for a period, then they'd be released from their labor requirement, and oftentimes giving land like other indentured servants, You oftentimes hear, or sometimes you may hear, how the many of the Irish who came in the early years came based on these indentured servitude contracts. So they would work for a while, and then they would be released from their labor and given whatever benefits they had been promised. Now, this has been going on for a while, and by 1676, the land around Jamestown in Virginia, where the representative of the English monarchy, the English government, their representative in Virginia, Jamestown, the governor of Jamestown, had negotiated a relationship with the indigenous people that lived in the area for so much, like, oh, okay, there's like, okay, you can have this space, but, we got a treaty, we got an agreement. This is how we'll set it up. You can use this space and the rest of it is ours, something like that. And over time, as the indentured servants kept coming and being released, the governor had allocated all the land that had been granted to the English in that area. So this guy came along, Nathaniel Bacon. He was like, well, wait a minute. We got folk who've been laboring and who worked and they've been released from their indentured servitude, and they're supposed to be getting land. How can you look? There's some open land over there. And the governor's like, no. The land is open, but we got an agreement with the native people, with the indigenous people, that we won't go over there. We'll stay in our area. And so this guy, Nathaniel Bacon, he gathered up other formerly indentured servants, both European and African, and said, well, we're going to take us some land. And if it requires us to go up against the local government of Jamestown, and then we'll have to do that. And that's called Bacon's Rebellion. That happened in 1676. And so the government was able to put down this rebellion. They were able to stop Bacon. And in the ensuing fight, Bacon died. He was killed. But the Europeans who took part, or the formerly indentured servants who were of European descent, many of them received jail time. I think that probably a couple of them were hanged. But the Africans that participated, who were formerly indentured, and who wanted this promise, who wanted to, take advantage of the privilege of the promise of land, they were placed, as a result of Bacon's rebellion, the Africans were placed in perpetual slavery, meaning that their service, they were enslaved again. And it's like, you don't get away, you're a slave forever. And if your mother is a slave, then all of her children will inherit that status. So that was Bacon's rebellion, and that was actually the beginning, some of the early beginnings and origins of African chattel enslavement, where African people were treated as property. Now in 1776, we have the first North American Civil War, where the citizens of Great Britain, who were sent over here to represent the government, the colonists, to set up a colony on behalf of the monarchy, decided that, in the face of Britain's decision at that time to end the international African slave trade and to end chattel slavery in the British Empire and possessions, the Caribbean, the European citizens of Britain, who had built their fortune on the backs of enslaved Africans, decided, they said, well, wait a minute, Britain. You can't just like, pull the rug from under us. This slavery thing is how we made our money. And, the British government said, well, you are subjects of the British crown. You do what we say do. And so from that, emerged this thing called the Declaration of Independence that stated partly, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, meaning that these rights were given to us by our creator, by God, and so no man can take them away from us. And these include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the writer, the primary author of this document, and many of the signers of this document were enslavers who had enslaved Africans, and who continued to, they were enslavers at the time that they drafted, debated, and signed this document, and they would continue to be enslavers even after it was presented, and they went to war with their mother country, Britain. And these enslavers included our friends, many of that who are called the fathers of our country, like George Washington. So many of the major actors and participants in what we call the founding of the America were in fact enslavers, and they went to war, not solely, but including it. One of the justifications or the things, the motivations for breaking away from Britain was economic, to maintain this system of African chattel enslavement. So we had the first North American Civil War, and in that war, the enslavers won. The enslavers that we now call the fathers of this country, they won, and they set up this corporation, this country called United States of America. But there were, like I said, that was a primary reason, but it wasn't the only reason for taking this action of creating the country. There were some people within the country who actually believed the rhetoric, and they were like, well, we don't agree that there ought to be this slavery thing going on. And so one of the things that was so there were some states in the U.S. that where it was against, where African chattel enslavement was against the law. Everybody in those states were free, and there were some where African chattel enslavement was the law. So people would leave, those areas where slavery was legal, and go to the areas where it wasn't, so they can live as free people. There's a motto in New Hampshire called "Live free or die." That was a choice that these people made. We'd rather die than stay here in this degraded state of slavery. And so, they went to these, what they call the free states. And in creating the Constitution of the United States, the areas that were represented by, or the slave states and their representatives, included in the Constitution several provisions that gave them the benefit of that helped them to be able to maintain slavery as an institution, social, economic, political institution. But there was there was enough success of African people struggling and resisting and seeking their freedom, that in 1850 the slave states were successful in passing federal legislation called the Fugitive Slave Act, that said that if someone had been enslaved in a state where it was legal, African chattel enslavement was legal, and they went to a place as a fugitive, ran away and went to a place where slavery wasn't legal, they could be returned. In fact, I think it's sort of like some of the immigration policy now, that the law, because it was legal in another place, had an obligation to return these people into their former state of enslavement. And that's kind of the level and the tempo of the times with stuff that was going on. So in 1850, there was the Fugitive Slave Act passed, and that raised the temperature around the debate a little bit. Then in 1860, 10 short years later, this guy named Abraham Lincoln was elected. And he was from up north. We generally point to his origin as Illinois. And so while Illinois was not a slave state where slavery was written into the Constitution, it allowed people to, if they came, because African people had been degraded to the level of property. If you entered that state, a free state, Illinois, any other, and you were an enslaver, then you can maintain that system. Because Lincoln was sympathetic, was not sympathetic to maintaining this degraded status of African people. He just kind of like thought like, hey, that's stuff. That's hey, what kind of sense does that make? Then the folk who were, and another thing that Lincoln talked about legislatively that upset people was that at this time, while Africans were enslaved, native people, indigenous people were constantly under attack and assault, a genocidal attack that was pushing them out of their lands or removing them by death or by displacement from their land. And as new land came into the possession of the European sphere of influence, they created states, new states. And so Lincoln was a Missouri Compromise around that time. It said that new states coming into the Union would not be slave states. They would not allow. There was a debate about whether they would allow slavery. And so Lincoln was sympathetic towards not increasing or allowing this political decision of slavery to continue. So in 1861, many of the legislators and many of the states that were slave states, where there were plantations, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, was traditionally called the Black Belt, Louisiana, all up in there. They said, well, hey, wait a minute, you guys, in the legislature, y'all folk up north and all, y'all going in the wrong direction. We feel like, we got certain unalienable rights that nobody can take away. And so we're going to start our own country. We're going to start the Confederate States of America. And that was the second North American Civil War. And the difference between the first and the second was that in the first North American Civil War, the enslavers won. Now here are the enslavers again, calling for war to protect, their nefarious, hellish, evil, despicable practice of African chattel enslavement, treating African people as property. And in the some of the declarations for the creation of this Confederate States of America, it states clearly, our position is thoroughly identified with slavery. So the war started 1861, the Second North American Civil War. And and things early on weren't going so good for the North. They ran down there saying like, hold up, y'all need to, back up, Southern states. We're in control here. And in fact, at Fort Sumner, I believe that was in Virginia, the Confederates came and took over this fort that was, an American Union fort. And so that's kind of started the war. And the Union, or the North, the northern states, the free state, quote unquote free states, weren't doing so well early on. And as a political decision, our friend Abraham Lincoln said, you know what, I'm trying to save the Union. I'm trying to save this country. So, and if that means, and if I can do that by, keeping slavery in place, I'll do that. If I can do that by taking slavery away, I'll do that. But I'll do whatever it takes to save the Union. Well, the Confederate states had decided, it's like, no, we ain't interested in no compromise. We're going to do our own thing. And so with the war looming in front of them, the politicians thought like, you know what? The major source of economic and resource production for the South are the enslaved Africans. So they came up with this idea, we're gonna, declare all of the Africans that are enslaved by these Confederate states, the states that are rebelling, That's free, the Emancipation Proclamation. In it, it states all persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion. And, you know, and they made some, what do you call, allowances or exceptions, even in some of the slave states, you know, where the Emancipation Proclamation would not apply. Also, this Emancipation Proclamation was only for the Confederate slave states, the states in rebellion. So all those states that were not in rebellion, where slavery was in existence, either inherited or you know, contemporarily created, they weren't affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. So when we hear, oh, the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery, that's a misstatement. That's misinformation. And then oftentimes it's weaponized and used as disinformation. So that's not true. That wasn't true. That isn't true. 1865, the Civil War ended. The enslavers lost. They lost the war, but some people would say they may have won the peace, because even though the legal and legislative authority to enslave people of African descent and treat them as property, African chattel enslavement, it did not address the dehumanization of the African personality in the European imagination. That continued on. So the war ended in 1865, I'm sorry. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued in 1863. Texas was one of the states in rebellion. The war ended in 1865. January, I think most people dated. And by June, the Union Army had reached Galveston, Texas. And the thing that many people don't know is that even at the start of the war, Frederick Douglass was advocating for Abraham Lincoln to include people of African descent as soldiers. And at first they were like, no, we don't want to do that. You know, we don't want to, you know, have a army of, you know, these folk of African descent. But finally they relented, and there were over 200,000 people of African descent who served as soldiers, and it was what they call colored. People of African descent were called colored at the time, and it was a colored regiment that went into Galveston, Texas, at the time where where the enslaved Africans were informed of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's well known that one of the reasons that many of the people knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, the war, and all of that at the time. So while it's stated that the African people didn't know about the Emancipation Proclamation, the truth is that the terrorism, the violence, and the brutality used to enslave African people was unrelenting. And it was only with the presence of armed soldiers that the European enslavers were willing to back up, and the enslaved were able to exercise their rights and privileges to the extent that they were. So it was later on December 18th, 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. And in that amendment, it said that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude would be allowed in the U.S. except in the case of imprisonment. So is Juneteenth a cause for celebration, or is it more solemn and cause for commemoration? Well, it is now is always the time to celebrate the end of unjust treatment. And with the coming of the soldiers into Texas, and with the earlier issuing a decision to issue the order the executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. That resulted in the end of the chattel enslavement of the folk in Texas. That was a reason for celebration, Texas as well as in other places. But it's also a time for commemoration. We got to remember that, both, not only did African people fight in the Civil War as soldiers, but they did a number of different things in terms of sabotage and supporting the efforts of the Union in the war. We talked about work slowdowns, even for folk who remained unjustly imprisoned and enslaved. So we got to remember and recognize the injustice that existed. There's I think Pope John Paul the 12th said something like, "What is owed in justice should never be given in charity." So this freedom that African people were denied was an unjust denial. So for them to be granted justice, that wasn't a charitable act. It wasn't something that we need to thank, and be grateful to the folk who took these measures, both the colored troops who fought in the war, as well as the troops of European descent. So we got to remember and recognize the injustice and the resilience of the African people that were able to maintain, what integrity and life they had, even in the face of and in the depths of the despair and the treatment that they were receiving. So, and finally in 2021, some people will say that at the time in 2021, there was an increasing call for a recognition of the contributions that that people of African descent made to this country in terms of its economic growth. At the time of the Civil War, the major industry in America, the major source of economic production was agriculture, and in plantation agriculture, in particular, cotton. Cotton, the growth of cotton and the picking of cotton fueled the agricultural industry in the South. It was shipped north, and it ended up fueling the growth of industrialization in the North. And you see the rivers, the Merrimack River that runs through New Hampshire down into Massachusetts, that's dotted with factories, with mill buildings, clothing mills. Those mills use that cotton that came from the South, and to create the industry that they created. Another thing with the Africans in the South, and because they were the greatest, because they were treated as property, they were considered the greatest asset, the largest, most valuable asset that existed in the U.S. And places like New York City and the financial industries were built based on financing the operation of these plantations. We have the insurance industry in Connecticut built on insuring, these agricultural, operations. And in places like Rhode Island, they grew its industry and its wealth from shipbuilding early on, with the importation of enslaved Africans and the what they call the transatlantic triangle. So as a result of just the recognition and acknowledgement of how this African chattel enslavement had contributed so greatly to this country, there are those who say that the policies that have continued as vestiges of African chattel enslavement, that African people are due some redress and remedies for the injuries that they suffered. And there's a call for reparations, and some suggest that the hasty approval of Juneteenth as a federal holiday was in response to those clamors for reparations for African chattel enslavement. So, this is the time, Juneteenth, for us to commemorate the work and the resilience of African people, to commemorate the end of this vile system of African chattel enslavement, to celebrate the the end of slavery, and also to educate about what happened, and to tell our story about what happened, to tell it from all sides, and to ensure that it's centered as a story of the people who are most impacted and affected negatively by this experience. And let's refuse to fall into the dominant narrative that paints a rosy picture about how this Juneteenth was some charitable offering, from these well-meaning individuals of European descent for the poor Africans. Let's tell the truth, and let's commemorate as well as celebrate Juneteenth. Thank you.